Good day everyone, I'm Jacques van Walt, one of the trainers at Miro, and I would like to welcome you to this BDCOM technical training. Now this technical training is a bit different than what we normally do. In this technical training we will do a basic product walkthrough and some technical aspects of what the product can do and cannot do. If you have any questions or queries regarding BDCOM and the switches that they do offer, please do not hesitate to pop us an email. You can email us at training@miro.co.za for all your training needs and just for some general information on your BDCOM switches and some extra technical aspects on what they can do, specifically on their fiber side. So, onto the walkthrough itself. Now, at default, your BDCOM, the default IP address is 192.168.0.1. Now, like any normal switch or managed switch, you need to be on the same layer 2 network and your IP address needs to be in the exact same subnet. So there's two ways to access the switch on default. It can either be done through the console port itself, where you go through SSH client like PuTTY, or you can plug in directly to one of the ports and just make sure that you are on the correct subnet or IP range. Browse to 192.168.0.1. Default credentials for this BDCOM unit will be admin and admin. So as soon as you start this unit up and you connect to it, on the first page will be your device status with some basic information on your switch. So you have your device type, which will be your model name. Now this model name is the S2510P. Now the 10 is the amount of ports that this unit have. This is now excluding your console ports. 2 of these ports is SFP ports as well, and then the remaining 8 ports is for your actual networking. So these 8 ports can be both PoE or non-PoE depending on your specific environment. Now this is an ATAF compliance switch, so can do both 24 and 48 volt PoE depending on your specific scenario. So here we have our basic BIOS version, our firmware build, the serial number of this unit, the MAC address of this unit, the default IP, the current date, and the uptime and your CPU usage. Now on the CPU and the memory usage, this is dependent on the amount of packets that's going through, as well as the amount of VLANs that's actually configured on this switch. On the information or interface state, some basic information on your gigabit Ethernet. So here we have gigabit 1 or G01 and G02. So the first 2 ports, these 2 ports, this is your actual SFP ports. The rest from port 3 up into port 10 will be your normal Ethernet ports. Currently I am connected to gigabit Ethernet 03. State is connected, it's enabled, gives me my MAC address, my speed at 1000 megabits per second, so full duplex, gigabits, and my transfer rate, both my input and my output rate, and currently flow control is disabled. You can refresh this page if and when you connect new units or connect to the data ports, but it's not necessarily, as it has its default refresh rate. On the interface flow itself, some more information on your gigabit Ethernet, the amount of packets or the amount of bytes that has been sent and received on both bytes packets, received bytes, received packets. You have discarded and also my discard rate. On the MAC address table, the MAC address table is probably the most important table to query for when you troubleshoot your units, as the MAC address table will dynamically or statically learn the MAC addresses within the network. This is just how the packets flow and how these units work. On most layer 2 devices, when a packet is received, a flood or a multicast or a broadcast will be sent over on all the ports just to learn the MAC address, and then as soon as the MAC address has been learned, it will update the MAC table. Now the MAC addresses within this MAC table can be refreshed, or it can be wiped out, but at most, default 100 MAC address records can be displayed on the web. If necessary to query more MAC addresses, you can input cmd show MAC address table in the cmd line. Now this is now when you SSH into this specific unit. On the log query, just the basic logs of these units. This is all the information on what currently is happening on this unit and what has happened on this unit as well. As you can see, my line Ethernet up and down, the VLAN specifics as well, and this is the place where you do most of your troubleshooting in these units. Your log is your best friend. Now there's different levels of the log where you can get the log level, emergencies, alerts, critical, errors, warnings, notifications, informational, debugging, and your dump information as well. You can filter it by date and by the level itself. On the optical module mode, we won't get any information on this specific page in this current lab, as there is no optical devices plugged into this unit. Now onto the basic configs. Basic configs, the host name of this unit, this is the name that will pop up in the ARP tables or within the neighbor lists in your routers or your switches. So you can define this, you can change it. We have the clock manager, where you can set the time and date of this unit. On default, it's set at manually, but it can be changed to manually. You can manually change it and set a specific year, month, day, and the time as well. Or just for better synchronization, you can do it through NTP. On the IP configuration, this is the current IP address of this unit. You see my MAC address, my IP address, my subnet at 255.255.0.0, and then I can add my default gateway if need be. On my port configuration, I have my port description for each specific port, so we can type in here SFP uplink. This can be for both of them, and here is my laptop plugged in. This can be the ISP, camera, whatever the case may be. This is where you rename the physical ports itself. So within your log query, if there was changes, something was plugged in, or there was configurations made on that specific port, the port description will be shown in the log files. Onto the port configuration, where I can enable and disable some of my ports. Rule of thumb, if a port is not used, it can be disabled so that no malicious devices can be connected to that specific port. But be aware, if you disable the ports and you need to log into this unit, you won't be able to unless you use the console port itself. The console port cannot be enabled or disabled. It's that specific port will always be ready for use. I can change my duplex and then my flow controller as well. From there, my rate limitations, a bit of quality of service built into the switch. My rate limitations I can add, so on Ethernet 3. My receive speed, I can do it on percentage wise. Let's make it 50%. or we can do it on 64 kilobits per second. This is all dependent on your specific unique needs. So I'm just going to reset that. Then on port mirroring, I can mirror a few ports. Current default state is it's disabled, so I want to mirror port 1, and then it will be mirrored out on port 10. It can be either for TX or RX or both, depending on your specific situation. So for now, I'm going to leave that at disable, reset, keep alive detection. I can enable it for an X amount of seconds. At general, at default it will be disabled. My port security, my IP MAC bindings, get some details on that. Currently there are no rules for my IP MAC bindings, but you can add it. Add your IP MAC bindings. My static MAC filtration, this is, you can see everything by default is access ports. My static MAC entry, and then my dynamic MAC filtration mode as well. On storm control, the storm controller is on broadcast, multicast and unknown unicast. So broadcast is a packet, it's sent from one to all, from everything on the specific network. Multicast is one to some, and unicast is one to one. So yeah, you can enable your broadcast storm protection, my threshold on packets per second, just so that your switch is not overloaded and brings down your specific network. Then port protect group, can add new rules, can add a group, and then we have the protect group interface configuration as well. And then we get to the PoE manager. Now on the PoE manager, you will note we have on top our global PoE configuration, global PoE real-time info, my interface list, PoE interface policy power, interface power real-time info, and then PoE interface and other real-time info. So at default, my power management is set to auto, but it can be preemptive as well, depending on the situation. My low disable threshold, if it's below this amount of milliwatts, it will not push out any power. Low no connect threshold as well. Then duration of PoE LEDs, my MIB notification function, thresholds of available power, and then my power counter, PoE chip automatic protection, stop, and then also my supply. So it can be either AT or AF or maximum power supply. On the maximum power supply, it will boost out on a singular port whatever is needed, but there are limitations. So if you force it on AF specifically, and you go to the PoE interface list, you will note that the port maximum power is at 3000 milliwatt. I can force this specific connection. As soon as I press apply, my light on the switch itself will always be on, and it will push out that amount of milliwatts through that specific port. So be wary and be careful when enabling or when forcing these specific ports. So I'm just going to reset that quickly. On my general info, my power supply usage threshold is at 100% at this stage. On my policy power, I can enable and disable my PoE function as well. So with this is a great thing if you want to power cycle. So if you can disable it and put a specific time range on it, let's say 5 minutes or so, put it in seconds, and then you unit will power cycle, or that specific port will power cycle. PoE interface and my real-time information. So this is the maximum power allowed to be pushed through, and it will show the current power that will be pushed through. Okay, from there on we get to the layer 2 configuration. So under the layer 2 configuration, this is where you add your VLANs and add a few other settings. So on the first is your VLAN configuration. Note on your VLAN configuration, default VLAN 1 is enabled. My default name, I can edit this, but I do have limited functionality. So on VLAN 1, default name, VLAN name will be on default. So I can change it to access or trunk port to my specific ports on where the VLAN can be enabled or disabled. So here we have allowed or not. Note that this will be grayed out at this stage. So my VLAN batch configuration, and then my interface VLAN attribute configuration. So on Gigabit Ethernet port 1, on the SFP, my mode will have your port VLAN ID. I can create an access or trunk port. My allowed VLANs from 1 to 4094. Add VLAN allowed range. Remove VLAN allowed range. And then my VLAN untag configuration. My specific ranges that can be done. So I can add a new VLAN. So let's make it VLAN 999 for instance. Let's call this trunk 999. And then on my specific ports, what VLANs, what will be the default VLAN? Will it be an access port or will it be a trunk port? Okay, so from there we go to GVRP. Now GVRP stands for Generic VLAN Registration Protocol. Now this protocol that facilitates control of virtual local area networks or VLANs within a larger network. The GVRP conforms to the 802.1q specification, which defines a method of tagging frames with VLAN configuration data. So you can enable and disable your GVRPs here, only if needed in your specific situation. Then we get to STP, or the Spanning Tree Protocol. Now you can disable it, SSTP and RSTP. Now in general, STP, this is for ring topologies and for limiting your broadcast storms and your multicast storms and multicast floodings. But in general networking, if you do not create any ring topologies, STP is not needed. For safety, it can be enabled, but otherwise, as it's not needed, it can be disabled altogether. But be careful on disabling it or enabling it if the correct configurations isn't being done on this switch. It can cause problems along the line. Then we have IGMP snooping, where you can enable it, transfer unknown or discard unknown, enable your IGMP snooping and enable auto query. IGM snooping on my VLAN list specifically, my static multicast address list, and then my multicast list. On the static list, I can add my VLAN and the specific ports where I want it to listen on. And then my static ARP, or my address resolution protocol, where it converts IP to MAC addresses. And then I have my static MAC configuration. where I can change the MAC addresses itself. And my LLDP, my link layer discovery protocol on this specific configuration. Open the LLDP protocol. In some cases this can be used in conjunction with your network management systems or NMS. Then I have my DDM protocol, my port channeling, my ring protection on the Ether ring or Ethernet ring itself. Can create a master node or a transmit node, and the master node will handle all the base traffic or all the configuration, and the transit node will just be the end node on the other side. So with this specific ring connection, I have my hello time, my fail time, and then my forward time. Now with Ethernet ring or the ring protection, it works in a similar way than STP, but it's just a lot faster. So if you have Ethernet ring in your specific network, you can use this for your ring protection. So basically you are deliberately creating a loop in your network. It will be a ring, but one of the ports will be disabled. Automatically. As soon as the main uplink fails, the redundant uplink will automatically come into play. This is a lot faster than your normal routing protocols and a lot faster than your STP. Then we have the backup link configuration as well. DHCP snooping, a default is disabled. My DHCP snooping on my VLANs, my interface configuration and interface binding list, and my manual configuration. My MTU size at default, a standard MTU of 1500, but it can support a maximum size of 9216, so 9216 byte MTU. Now this is considered jumbo packets. And then my PDB configurations. Now from layer 2 to layer 3, on layer 3 there is basic functionality on layer 3. So on layer 3, VLAN interface and IP address. This is where I can have my specific VLAN, and my IP configuration can be on DHCP auto configuration, or it can be on manual. So I have a primary, secondary, and then another secondary IP address too. So I can have fallback IP addresses, which is always a great thing to have. On advanced configuration, I can add quality of service, specifically my COS or my cost of service, the value ranging from 0 to 7, and then my quality of service global configuration can add different queues for different specific situations. So on cost of service, at my queue map there are 4 queues. So when it's from 0, 0 will be first in the queue, 1, 2 and 3 will be second, 4 and 5 will be third, and then 6 and 7 will be in my last queue. IP address list, my ACLs, I can add an ACL or access control list, and this is where you view your specific access list applications. And then the same with MAC addresses. You can also have a MAC ACL as well. The network manager itself, we have the SNMP. We can add your SNMP community strings for manageability. On read write, changes can be made. Just on read, you can send specific information. Then my ROM1 configuration, diagnostic tools, more or less exactly the same than in most of the routers. or in most of the switches, you have a basic ping diagnostic tool, a ping test, duration, source IP address, and then the size of the packets. And then finally we get to the system manager. On the system manager, you can add new users, username, password, my pass group, and then my authentication group. Here we have the group manager. I have a group name, my pass group manager, authentication group manager, and then authorization group manager as well. And then we have the log manager. We can enable a log server and specify the specific server address for these logs. And then on my startup configuration, now the startup configuration is the main configuration or the main configuration file for this unit. So I can export this. As soon as I export, it can be downloaded. And I can also browse to import a previously exported file. Then system and software. I can back up my system, and then I can update my system as well. And then finally, reboot. So this unit generally takes about 2 to 3 minutes to fully reboot. As soon as this unit is rebooted and the startup configuration is in play, the unit will work without a hitch. Now the firmware of these layer 3 switches are fairly stable, as there isn't a lot of firmware updates coming out each year, which is a great thing, as some vendors you have stability issues. But I would like to thank you for joining me in this technical walkthrough. If there's any questions, please email us at training@miro.co.za. I'm Jacques van der Walt, and thank you.